Let's talk about Udyr. The long-awaited Udyr rework is finally here, modernizing one of League's most bizarre juggernauts. Udyr has always promised choice and versatility, but time has not been kind to him. The majority of his old builds were relegated to for fun status, as his most dominant made him easily one of the most threatening junglers, with an almost non-existent play rate because too many players found his play pattern mind-numbingly boring. The new Udyr has obviously added more complexity while staying true to the essence of the old champion, but has he truly been given more choices? As usual, I got together with my community to answer this question, testing as many roles, builds, and playstyles as time allowed for. Remember, as always, that it's impossible to have learned everything there is to know before Udyr releases, so please treat this video as a primer rather than a definitive guide. Since Udyr is a rework and not a brand new champion, I will be making occasional references to his old incarnation, but rest assured that you should still get a clear picture of what Udyr does without any prior knowledge. In this video, we'll be covering Udyr's abilities, his various skill orders, the basics of his stance dancing and awakening usage, his purpose and playstyle, and his runes and itemization. Like his pre-rework incarnation, Udyr has no true ultimate and instead has 4 basic abilities with 6 ranks each. Each of Udyr's basic abilities set his active stance, and they each have a 4-second duration buff, an auto attack steroid, and a unique effect called an awakening. Each ability's buff persists when swapping stances, but its auto attack steroid does not. When Udyr's active stance is on cooldown, he can recast it to awaken it, empowering it with additional effects. Awaken has its own cooldown defined by Udyr's passive, is available at level 1, and is effectively his ultimate. Udyr's secondary passive is straightforward but playstyle defining. After casting an ability, Udyr's next 2 auto attacks within 4 seconds gain 30% attack speed and refund 5% of Awaken's cooldown. Udyr's Q, his bear stance, is an offensive single target stance. The stance buff grants attack speed and physical damage on hit. The auto attack steroid causes Udyr's next 2 attacks to deal bonus % max health physical damage. Notice, and this is true for all of Udyr's stances, that this auto attack steroid does not fall off over time and is stored for as long as Udyr stays in bear stance. Bear stance's awakening grants an extra, stronger attack speed buff and causes his next 2 attacks to unleash chain lightning, dealing % max health damage over 6 bounces. Chain lightning bolts can bounce to the same target repeatedly, so it's ideal against isolated targets. Udyr's W, his boar stance, is his primary defensive stance. The stance buff grants a shield for 4 seconds. The auto attack steroid grants Udyr 15% lifesteal and a flat heal on his next 2 auto attacks. Boar stance's awakening doubles the auto attack steroid, grants a second, larger shield, and causes Udyr to regenerate health over 4 seconds. Udyr's E, his ram stance, is his primary crowd control stance. The stance buff grants movement speed, decaying to 30% over the first 1.5 seconds. The auto attack steroid causes Udyr's auto attacks to lunge at targets, which effectively increases his range, and stuns on hit. Ram stance has a per target stun cooldown. Ram stance's awakening grants a huge amount of movement speed and crowd control immunity for the first 1.5 seconds of its buff, but be aware that this is not a cleanse. This ability is virtually unchanged from pre-rework Udyr's stun. It grants more movement speed and has a lower per target cooldown, but its CC duration is shorter. Udyr's R, his Phoenix stance, is an offensive AoE stance that doubles as a utility stance. The stance buff creates a storm centered on Udyr that slows and deals magic damage over time. The auto attack steroid causes Udyr's next 2 auto attacks to deal extra magic damage to all enemies within the storm. Udyr does not strike his enemies with a full AoE basic attack. Secondary targets will take only the extra magic damage. If the storm no longer exists but Udyr still has empowered auto attacks available, they strike in the space that the storm would occupy. Phoenix stance's awakening refreshes the storm's duration and detaches it from Udyr, causing it to seek out Udyr's last attacked target, applying a stronger slow, and dealing % max health damage. If Udyr's cooldowns are low enough, it is possible to have an awakened storm and a base storm active at the same time. Udyr's simple abilities introduce us to the 2 primary themes of this champion. The first is a simple shell hiding a very complex interior. There's a lot of numbers to digest if you want to truly appreciate what each ability does. The second is choice and versatility. Pre-rework Udyr was intended to offer the same choice, but only had one real viable build at the highest levels of play. I'm not convinced that this is true of the new Udyr. So with that in mind, before we can talk about what you should max first, let's look carefully at the numbers. Udyr has very few AD ratios, all of which are bonus AD ratios and on his bear stance, though it should be noted that a few properties of W and passive are designed to empower AD builds. He has quite a few more AP ratios spread predominantly across his Phoenix and Boar stance, which importantly means that building AP can augment durability. The primary effects of each stance are rank scaling effects, asking for some skill point investments. However, the awakening effects of each stance are generally level scaling effects. Boar stance is the only ability ability whose awakening also scales with ranks, both in shield and in regen, and it's the only stance with HP ratios. Notably, Ram stance scales only with ranks, no ratios, excluding its level scaling awakening, but as we'll soon see, Ram stance should be your least common awakening anyway. The implications of these numbers are the following. First, Udyr will still generally choose between his two offensive stances, Bear and Phoenix stance, but the awakenings of each can still be viable options on the opposite build. Second, Ram stance is generally trying to get some of your early skill points since Boar stance is designed to scale more with levels and items instead, but you have to be aware that you're investing primarily into its per target cooldown since it always decays back down to its rank 1 movement speed after 1.5 seconds. Finally, Boar stance is just overwhelming if Udyr is given both gold and XP. In my experience, if you're choosing a tank build on Udyr, you do have access to both Bear and Phoenix skill orders. I believe Phoenix, with its high base damage and utility, is the generalist first max. However, Bear has its place. It performs noticeably better in the early skirmishes, softens single frontliners very effectively, and could be used as a strong engage deterrent, but it struggles more against even light mobility. Bear may outperform Phoenix in an anti-dive or bait and punish composition. Pre-rework Udyr used to skill QRR at level 3 for a faster jungle clear. I don't believe this is best for the new Udyr, as having 3 stances by level 3 grants you 100% uptime on your new attack speed passive, which is better for his clear speed. I have 3 tested skill orders on Udyr that I think will all gain value in different situations, and I'm sorry but they're all complicated, so I have to list the full progression on screen. First is our generalist Phoenix build. I think Phoenix should be your standard on tank Udyr, especially since its core damage component is its buff, allowing you to swap to Boar stance without losing DPS. You'll notice that I invest 3 points into E before doing the same to W, then maxing E. That's because of Boar and Ram scaling, as I mentioned earlier. I value the early movement speed and per target stun uptime, but then as Udyr's HP increases, Boar stance becomes overwhelming and increasing its HP ratio is desirable. I'm not 100% sure that it's correct to revert to maxing Ram over Boar once Boar has 3 points, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to learn that 6 points in Boar by level 16 is optimal. Moving on, Udyr's second potential skill order is the same as the first, but substituting Phoenix ranks for Bear ranks. Note that base Bear is strongest around level 5 to 7, while base Phoenix only starts to feel noticeably damaging around 9 to 11, so if you're opting into this skill order, you're investing more into the early game. Finally, there's a simple QWE order that goes all in on pure combat power at the cost of reach. I think this order can only be viable under 2 circumstances. Either Udyr is the top laner, or the enemy's comp forces them to engage into him. It should be pretty obvious that Udyr has no traditional combos, but you do need to know how to prioritize his stances, how to cast his awakenings, and when you should care about his attack speed passive. Udyr is by nature committal and has very few short trade patterns. You must have Ram's buff or Ghost active in order to get away, and we obviously don't want to spend Ghost on chip damage. This means that in most cases, once Udyr starts fighting, he stays in combat until his enemy chooses to escape or until someone dies. After Udyr has chosen his 4 ability sequence in a fight, his cooldowns mandate that he sticks to that 4 ability sequence until an awakening gives him the opportunity to make a new decision. This means that the method Udyr chooses to open his fights is very important. As a general rule, Udyr wants to cast his awakening very early into a fight, or at the beginning of his camp clear, so that he's able to benefit from awakening cooldown reduction, ideally getting multiple casts off in an extended fight. So with the basics on the table, we can now talk about the default usage of each stance, and please consider that I'm outlining the default, not the only way of using these abilities. In the vast majority of engagements, Udyr will be opening with his Ram stun, swapping to his primary damage stance, activating the buff of his secondary damage stance, and closing his sequence with Boar. So we'll start with Ram. If Ram is being cast for the first time in a fight, we usually don't care about Udyr's passive, we just want to stun and swap. Ram's awakening is highly situational, and unnecessary use leads to Udyr losing extreme damage. It is cast out of necessity to dodge lethal CC, to catch stragglers at the end of a fight for cleanup, or on early ganks when your sole job is to set up the damage of your laners. Reckless Ram awakening usage consistently leads to lost fights. If Udyr doesn't have to open with Ram and can instead open with his primary damage stance because someone walked into him, obviously that's excellent. In that case, you would simply insert Ram into your stance sequence whenever you need a stun or an escape. Then Udyr swaps to his primary damage stance. If it's Phoenix and Awakening is available, don't bother exhausting Udyr's passive, just get the Awakening off as fast as possible for damage. Most of the damage is from your Storm, not your Phoenix empowered autos. If it's Bear, do use Udyr's passive before Awakening or you lose 2 empowered Bear autos, which are necessary for damage. Bear stance is one of the better stances to just sit in. Swapping to your secondary damage stance is usually necessary afterwards. Phoenix gives Bear builds some much needed stickiness, and Bear gives Phoenix the attack speed you need to optimize your next Boar cast and reach your next Phoenix Awaken. Because we're late into our stance sequence, we're now using Udyr's passive to the fullest at every opportunity to wait for cooldowns and restore Awakening. Boar stance typically ends our stance sequence solely because casting it with Bear's buff ticking optimizes our empowered sustain autos, and because our other stances are usually more urgent. Use Udyr's full passive with Boar whenever possible. The only situation in which we wouldn't spend these autos is if Boar Awakening is needed immediately as a panic button. Boar Awakening is absurdly strong, but it's often at its best as your second Awakening in a fight. It can swing close duels very hard, and it can buy time for your teammates, but it does little compared to Bear and Phoenix Awakenings early into a fight when your HP is high. So to recap, here's our standard Phoenix sequence. Here's our standard Bear sequence. Here's Udyr's primary short trade or peel. Here's how you best impact a fight at low HP. Even though I've just explained our default stance dancing preference, do not get too rigid. It is almost always intuitive which stance or awakening you need next in the moment if a decision is available to you, but you will miss those decision points if you're just mindlessly going through the motions. Udyr, much like his pre-rework counterpart, is a hyper-durable juggernaut who defends his teammates by threatening either direct or counter-dive retaliation against forward enemy positioning. Udyr has not fundamentally changed a lot in playstyle. He still shouldn't be the primary initiation, he is inherently defensive and punish-oriented. The old run-stun-job-done playstyle is intact, but it's harder to execute offensively since Udyr is a bit slower than before. If Udyr can force a situation in which he can cut off the enemy's backline follow-up and force both frontliners to 1v4, he is thriving as long as he is well farmed, but patience is key. If a flank gives you backline access, take it. If an enemy frontliner is in your face, hit them. If the enemy's positioning is awful and Ghost gives you free access to carries, obviously go for it. But if a teamfight can only be started by using Ram Awaken, just be patient. You are a defensive champion. Udyr has the potential to become utterly unkillable without sacrificing any damage, more so than any other juggernaut in the game, but to get to that point he still needs farm. Udyr remains a scaling full clear champion after his rework, especially on a Phoenix build which takes more time to get online than a Bear build. He should only be looking for high percentage ganks and skirmishes, and his Awaken should always be up if he chooses to interact in the early game, or he's fighting as half a champion. Awaken does give Udyr more means to interact early than before, so early ganks and duels are easier and stronger. But Udyr's high econ requirements mean that he really cannot afford to waste time on a gank gone wrong. Junglers should know what I mean when I say to gank like Karthus or pre-6 Fiddlesticks does. I have to add a disclaimer here that in my entire history with pre-rework Udyr, I've only really studied jungle tank Udyr, so I don't have the same prior experience that I can apply to the new Udyr in top lane. Of course, a high econ champion with access to lane income sounds appealing, and Bear stance autos deal quite a bit more damage to typical top lane champions than the old Tiger stance did earlier into the game. The potential problem with top lane Udyr is clear. He has no reach whatsoever and virtually no mobility, so his only method of securing farm is to have high enough base numbers to discourage trades. Otherwise, he loses even on his own slow pushes and is vulnerable to freezes. He struggles a lot to interact with champions who have complex trading patterns, and much like Garen, there's really no outplaying certain tools. The only real amount of complexity in Udyr's trades is his Bear Awakening, making him uniquely good at fighting away from minion waves. This means that if Udyr top is viable, it's only as a counterpick against champions who have no answers to his raw numbers, likely scaling melee top laners like Quinn. However, once we discover what his good matchups are, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the new Udyr was a situationally viable top laner. I've played support Udyr, it's bad, don't play it. You just don't have the income to do Udyr things, but honestly, the lane phase was playable. This makes me believe that the new Udyr could be a viable partner to fasting or support Senna. His defensive play pattern protects her very effectively and her sustain empowers his laning. Watch out for it. In following Udyr's theme of choice and versatility, his itemization is fairly open. Please understand that time constraints allowed us to identify many functional builds, but prevented us from defining pick conditions for each. Udyr's core stats are ability haste and effective HP. We want to optimize his ability to cycle through stances and survive in the middle of enemies. Udyr is obligated to be durable, but it's not hard to justify specific single damage items. The build I'm absolutely certain about is the standard full tank Sunfire Rush. Sunfire Aegis gives Udyr everything he could possibly want, providing necessary defenses with high damage that complements Udyr's play pattern. Turbo Chem Tank, in my opinion, tries to turn Udyr into something he's not. It sacrifices too much damage, and if Udyr doesn't deal damage when he's given an opening, he isn't threatening. If you're opting for the full tank build, you're not making any legendary decisions that differ from other tanks. Every build beyond this point is proven to work, we just don't know when to build them. Sunfire Rush has some damage-oriented variants for both core ability orders. Phoenix Udyr gains a lot of value from Demonic Embrace to the point that I wouldn't be surprised if the item becomes standard. Sunfire directly into Demonic is an excellent damage spike, but its durability hasn't been properly tested. The equivalent Bear build is Sunfire Sterix Titanic. Obviously it won't perform well if you're ranking Bear in an inappropriate situation, but otherwise it's an excellent blend of damage and durability. The really spicy Sunfire builds are the Legendary Rush options, Bork Sunfire for Bear builds and Nashor's Sunfire Demonic for Phoenix. These are both designed for higher dueling power, using the attack speed for increased awakening access, but both sacrifice durability, which is generally unappealing. The Nashor's variant in particular is the variant I have the least confidence in, and it's the most likely to be a for fun build, but perhaps the Bork variant is perfect for games that require heavy early skirmishing. Remember when considering other mythic options that every other mythic must compete against Sunfire, which is a tall order. If any item can compete, I suspect it's Riftmaker. The build path isn't particularly strong, but when completed, vamping off a Phoenix Storm empowered by AP while also taking advantage of Boar's AP ratios seems reasonable enough for a bruiser build. While Udyr's Sheen synergy is strong, I haven't found Trinity Force or Sunderer to be more appealing than Sunfire. At the end of the day, Sunfire builds are unquestionably the optimal way to go, but Udyr's kit does lend itself to some for fun mythics. Who am I to tell you not to build Ludens or Gale Force or Trinity? They do technically work, and pre-rework Udyr one-tricks had a lot of weird niche expertise on these off-meta items. Experiment and go wild. Oh, but for completeness, Phoenix builds love early Darkseal. Lucidity boots are usually the best boot option, but Merc Treads may be necessary in some games, and in rare situations you may find Steel Caps necessary, especially in the top lane. Blue Smite is great for sticking to your targets, making it the generalist jungle starting item, but Red Smite might be the right option for certain bear games. For runes, you'll find Lethal Tempo less mandatory than before. Remember that the old Phoenix builds relied on high attack speed to optimize damage, but new builds just need the storm ticking. That said, Lethal Tempo is still excellent for optimizing your awakening. Your cooldowns are low enough to combine Lethal Tempo with your passive without running out of stances to cast. But Lethal Tempo being technically optional means Phase Rush is a legitimate option now, likely taken in response to certain enemy backlines with soft mobility. I would only ever consider Press the Attack on top lane Udyr since he's so base stat dependent up there, but it does proc before Udyr is expected to cast his Bear Awakening. Please remember that I'm assessing runes from the perspective of someone almost entirely experienced on tank Udyr. If you have a rune idea meant to optimize specific damage builds, then by all means take it. So that's the reworked Udyr. I hope you'll forgive some of the uncertainty around alternate builds. Udyr is a great champion with a lot more in-combat decisions to make than before, and his old optimal playstyle appears to carry over very well, but so do his meme builds. And on a champion like this, it's hard to immediately determine what's still a meme build and what's legitimately viable, especially under time constraints. At the very least, that means that the new Udyr has something to offer for everyone, and a lot more optimization to be done down the road, which is exciting. I hope as that optimization progresses that you'll all share what you learn in the comments below, and I hope that this video helps you to prepare for when the Udyr rework rages onto the Rift.